And the title of this lecture is History. And what does history mean? Is it just history? Sarah Grace, what does history mean?
Story.
Exactly. It is his story. So I got this from missionary Hannah Ryu. His story, God's story, how God fulfills his eternal salvation plan through his faithful servants and martyrs from the beginning of history, from the beginning of creation to the very end, until he comes through his judgment and raises up his eternal kingdom. So let's learn a little bit about this, his story. And let's first read the key verses from Revelation chapter 21, verse 7, and Revelation chapter 20, verse 6. Let's go. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. And first, we're going to start with Egyptian history. And I have a small overview over the 6 history lectures. As we see, we will talk about Egypt today. And in the next lecture, we will going to talk about the empires of Assyria and Babylonia, then about Persia, and we will also see the spiritual revival in Europe, not in Europe, but among the Israelites. Then we will talk about the Greece and the Diadochi empires. This is the intertestamental period, and we will see how how God also continues his history in this seemingly dark time. And then in the 5th lecture, we will talk about Rome, and we will see 2,000 years of church history, beginning from Jesus, the apostles, until today. So let's first talk a little bit about the Roman Empire. How did the Roman Empire develop? The Egyptian Empire. The Egyptian Empire was established around 3000 before Christ. And as you can see, we have here the clear hierarchy. This is the God-given hierarchy that was from the very beginning of the Egyptian Empire and the Egyptian kingdom. And everyone had a clear task. There was the king. The king was a god. He was the high priest, he was the highest judge, he was the army commander, and he had absolute power over the whole kingdom. Then we had his vizier. The vizier was the king's deputy. And there were also the officials and civil administrations, so all who served the king to administrate the country. And in the 3rd stage, we have the craftsmen. To the craftsmen belong all the physicians, the peasants, the carpenters, the architects, and at the lowest of the whole society are the slaves and the foreigners who have to do all kind of the dirty work. And these are the foundations of the Egyptian high culture, which lasted for the next 2,700 years. First, we have a sacred god kingdom with a godlike king who has absolute rule, so who controls all the resources of his country and who is the first intercessor for his people to the gods. So the Egyptian king at that time had power like Louis XIV in absolutistic France. Secondly, there was the yearly Nile flooding. This Nile flooding provides a profitable and fruitful harvest every year. And this is the source of life for Egypt, which is surrounded by desert. And third, there's one common religion and mortuary cult which connects all Egyptians together. So religion is very important in ancient Egypt. And we have one common universal language, the hieroglyphs, which also represents the holy symbols for the gods. So we have to keep that in mind, because Egyptian history always consisted of, when one of these 4 founding blocks is destroyed, whole Egypt is going to go down. And from around 3000 to 2000 BC, we have the Old Kingdom and the first intermediate period. And already in that time, Egypt was a world power, because it was the world's first high culture, and from that time, all the pyramids that we know until today come. So I think many of you know the 4th dynasty pyramids of Khufu, so Cheops, Khafre, Chephren, and Mykerinos. And these pyramids at that time, because they were so big, these are the greatest pyramids, the greatest buildings ever built. Scientists still don't know how the Egyptians could build them. And they were a symbol of power and mightiness of the Egyptian gods and of the Egyptian king. But all this vanished at around 500 years after the beginning of the Old Kingdom, at around 2160, where Egypt dived into the first intermediate period. And this first intermediate period, this was for the Egyptians a phase where the gods kind of lost the control and chaos reigned over the country. But the Egyptians kind of got happy again, because in this time, the rise of Thebes happened. So Thebes is the capital city of the next Egyptian kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and this was kind of the preparation phase for superpower Egypt. So where Egypt has had its greatest power. In this time period, all the reunification of all the split local kingdoms of Egypt happened. And we also know, when we look at biblical history, that at that time, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob lived as the patriarchs in Canaan. And then there comes the new kingdom, the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom, this is around from the 12th to 15th or 16th dynasty. In this Middle Kingdom, so you have to know there are 3 main kingdoms in ancient Egypt: the Old Kingdom, which we talked about, the Middle Kingdom, where we'll talk about now, and the New Kingdom, which we will talk about also. And the most powerful king of this Middle Kingdom was Sesostris III. He is also known as the caretaker. So, and under his reign, there was cultural flourishing in Egypt. So they began to worship Amun and Osiris with festivals and temples. There was the medicine papyrus of Kahun and the Edwin Smith papyrus, so many scientific advancement, cultural advancement, and Egypt was kind of the top country in the world developing all those things. There was also copper, iron, turquoise, gold mining, all sorts of things. But Sesostris III is also known as the caretaker. So when we look at this, at his statue, we see that it is not the typical statue as the proud Egyptian pharaohs, but his face is worried, and he has very big ears. It is because at that time there was a big famine and hunger crisis, and therefore the king Sesostris III, he wanted to depict himself as the one who takes care of his people. And we can connect that also to his story. Because in this time, God led Jacob's family into Egypt to make them there into a great nation. And at this famine, we believe today is the famine where Joseph rose and became the vizier to serve not only Egypt but also his family and the council of God. But also this kingdom vanished just around 300 years later, around 650 before Christ. It declined into the second intermediate period. And this second intermediate period was the period of the Hyksos. I think many of you know the Hyksos. And the Hyksos invaded Egypt around 1650, and they also brought many advancements. For example, we have the Shaduf. This is like a water system, advanced water system, with which agriculture could be made more advanced in Egypt. Also composite bows, so new weapons, horses and chariots. So cavalry, or when you wanted to take it in modern terms, artillery, was introduced into Egypt. And all this, horses, chariots, the new weapons, the Egyptians, who kind of suffered under the reign of the Hyksos, they used this against the Hyksos to expel these enemies and rise up once again to a new kingdom. And this new kingdom it's literally called the New Kingdom, and there Egypt reached its absolute climax. So let's look let's look at how this kingdom looked like. Now, at first we can say that it was the world's leading power of the world, of the whole world. And it reached its most powerful extent at the reign of Thutmose III, who reigned in the 15th century before Christ. All lands between Nubia is here in the, Nubia is here in the very south, to Palestine and all his vassals. So this empire was about 2,500 kilometers long. It was very huge. And all the sons of the defeated kings, they were taken to the Pharaoh's court. So all the countries that were conquered by Egypt and that were also dependent on Egypt, and they had to pay tribute to him, and they had to be friends of Egypt, because the king of Egypt, they took all their sons and all their elite to Egypt. And it was because that they could get so big, because Egypt had the most powerful army, the strongest army of the world. So Egypt was kind of like the United States today, or in the 20th century. And Egypt was so powerful that everyone wanted to be Egypt's friends. So suddenly, at around 1400, everyone began to bring, as you can see here, gifts to Egypt so that they can be friends with Egypt. Everyone wanted to make peace with Egypt. For example, the Mitanni, who were once enemies of Egypt, they sought peace with Egypt. Also, the Kassite Babylon, they also wanted to have good trade relationship with Egypt. And even the Greek people, the Minoan cultures, they brought gifts to Egypt because they recognized that Egypt is the leading power, not only in this Middle East region, but globally. And finally, the main enemy of the Egyptians, the Hittites, they also made peace with Ramesses II. So everyone wanted to be friends of Egypt and want to make good trade relationships with them so that everyone can profit from each other. And because of that, superpower Egypt was the richest and the wealthiest country in the world. And to show this, I want you to look at the Aten Revolution. Now, I think some of you know the Aten Revolution. This was a revolution where the pharaoh Akhenaten, he deposed Amun as the main god, and he said, okay, Aten is the new sun god, and there's no polytheism, it's only monotheism. But in the end of the story this is not the important point. The end of the story is he had to roll everything back, and this was done by his son, Tutankhamun, who rolled back all this revelation. And this Tutankhamun, he only reigned 13 years. So he was a relatively unimportant, insignificant king. And he also reigned only 13 years because he was ill, and he died of a bone disease. But how was he buried? So this is his tomb. And we can see in his tomb there are three. So his coffin was laid within 3 golden coffins. Around there was a quartzite coffin, and around that were again 4 golden shrines. And then at the other rooms you can see all kinds of useful tools that tools mostly also made out of pure gold that the Egyptians gave to his tomb so that he could survive in the life after his death. So, and this shows Egypt's abundant wealth. Because when this insignificant king, Tutankhamun, was buried like this, with the numerous golden shrines around his body, how then were the even greater kings like Thutmose III, Sethos I, or Ramesses II, how were they buried? And I only brought this example because Tutankhamun's, as you may know, Tutankhamun's tomb is the only tomb where we could find all this. Everything else was robbed because of the so much wealth of the Egyptian kingdom and the Egyptian pharaohs. And finally, it was the state in which everybody wanted to live. So for this, we can go a little bit further in history, and we can look at the reign of Ramesses II and III. Ramesses II was known as the greatest Egyptian architect of all time. He followed the example of his hero, Amenhotep III, which was a king a time before him. And from Ramesses II, we know many buildings. We know the military cities he built, for example, Ramesse. We know Abu Simbel. I think many of you know Abu Simbel. He also extended this very big Karnak and Luxor temple complex, which was around, at that time the largest temple complex in the world. And he also built his Ramesseum. This is his mortuary temple. And this Ramesseum has 19-meter high statues. So he built very imposing buildings. And Ramesses III, he wanted to follow the example of Ramesses II. He tried to do even greater works. So he also built his own tomb in the Valley of Kings in Thebes, which is one of the greatest tombs among all the kings there. He also built his own mortuary temple at Medinet Haber in Luxor, which is, I think some of you also know, which is also an extremely big complex. And he made very many gifts to be popular among the people. So he gave 100,000 servants, 30,000 square kilometer land, 330 kilogram to the gods of Egypt to satisfy the gods. And this shows how abundant, of what abundant wealth Egypt was. And Egypt was so rich that every people from all countries, they wanted to live in Egypt, they wanted to work in Egypt, they wanted to have the goods from Egypt, and that's why Egypt, for example, Egypt's food, they were known as the meatballs of Egypt, because all the quality food, it all came from Egypt. So, but when all this happened, when Egypt was so powerful, where can we put the Exodus into? Now, there are two possibilities. We have first the 1450 BC theory. This states that the Israelites entered Egypt around 1880 before Christ, and around 1530 Moses was born. So he likely grew up under Hatshepsut, and around 1440 must be the Israelite Exodus under the reign of Thutmose III. So Thutmose III, very important king, the most powerful king of ever of the whole Egyptian history. So we should keep that in mind. The reason why this is one possibility is because the Solomonic temple was constructed around 960 BC, and First King states that when this temple was constructed, 480 years had passed when the Israelites exited Egypt. So one possibility, exit around 1450 to 1440 BC. The second theory is the 1250 BC theory, so 200 years later. Now this fits with Pi-Ramesse as built under Ramesses II around 1250. And for this, the history goes as that Jacob entered Egypt around 1650, so when the Hyksos, in the second intermediate period, took power in Egypt. They were enslaved under a new king, probably the new kingdom that we talked about. And around 1330, Moses would have been born, so Moses would have likely grown up with Ramesses I and Ramesses II. And around 1250, there would now be the Israelite Exodus under the reign of Ramesses II. And Ramesses II, as we learned about, the architect pharaoh, also very important king that we should remember because he was so powerful. But regardless of what time the Exodus happened, 1450 or 1250, we know that the Exodus must have been a very traumatizing event for the Egyptians, because a seemingly undefeatable Egypt, at the climax of its power, was defeated through a slave nation and through an invisible hand. So this is the Egyptian point of view. When we look at the 10 plagues, we see that through each plague, an Egyptian god was defeated. For example, through the first plague, Seb, the god of water and the Nile flooding, was defeated. And the Nile was the source of water, so this was already very bad for the Egyptians. Then Bastet also, the god of fruitfulness, was also defeated. Amun-Ra, the sun god and the most powerful god of ancient Egypt, he was also defeated. And Isis, the goddess of life and birth, of rebirth, of magic, in the 10th plague, was also defeated. Also Ptah, the god of creation, of crafting, the giver of life, he was also defeated. All of the gods, they had no power before the sovereign God. So this showed the Egyptian gods are dead. The pharaoh is powerless. And when we look back at these 4 founding principles of the Egyptian empire, we see the sacred god kingdom with a godlike king, crushed. Yearly Nile flooding, crushed. One common religion, a mortuary cult, crushed. And so the Exodus and the 10 plagues and the power of God, they must have been an existential threat to the Egyptians. But this is the Egyptian point of view. What is God's story behind that? What is his story? It shows that God is faithful to his promise and leads the Israelites out of Egypt as victors. The new kingdom seemed to be unbeatable, and the Israelites at first, they couldn't believe it either. But it could never stop God's promise and counsel. When we look at Exodus chapter 6, it says, I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with the mighty acts of judgment. With mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give Abram, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. So this great promise, this was a really great promise. And personally, it reminded me of Revelation chapter 21. It's kind of the same. Here, the Holy Land and being God's people, living with God, is promised to the Israelites. And we see how God used one person, Moses, who faithfully held to this promise and witnesses and fights for God's promise. So Moses repeatedly witnessed this promise of God before the hardened Pharaoh. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. He did this almost every plague. The Pharaoh wouldn't let him go. He tried to make many compromises with Moses, but Moses said clearly, let my people go. Let the whole people of God go out of Egypt to follow God's promise. Even when Moses had to face death, as the Pharaoh said to him, the day you see my face again, you will die, he still held on to that promise of God and confessed it and witnessed it. And then God gave them the Passover. Those who held the Passover, who testified to God, who put their whole faith in the sovereign Almighty God by slaughtering the perfect lamb, taking its blood and putting it at their door frames, they will be saved. And they will go out of Egypt as the true victors, while the Egyptians lost everything, even the lives of all their firstborns. As Exodus chapter 12 says, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over for you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. And because the Israelites at that moment put their whole faith in God and testified to God's salvation, where they could go out of Egypt as the true victors. And they could be called to be a kingdom of priests, to be a blessing for all nations, to give glory, praise, and honor to God, to be his chosen people and God's holy nation, as we know well from Exodus chapter 19, 5 and 6. But the Israelites, as a slave nation, they had to learn to live as people of God, and they repeatedly rebelled. And you know about the calf, you know about the repeated rebellion in the book of Numbers, and God sometimes was at the point where he wholly wanted to extinct Israel. But here we see again how God used, or how Moses faithfully held on to and prayed to God with the promise of God, so that Israel was preserved and God could continue his salvation history. When they worshipped the calf, Moses prayed for them. Remember your servants Abram, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever. Then the Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he has threatened. But now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. And you know how God answered? My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Though the Israelites were unfaithful, God always stayed faithful. And because of the prayer of one person who was willing to give the life so that God's counsel can be continued, God wanted to continue his counsel with Israel. And then when the 12 explored Canaan and there was a great rebellion among the Israelites, Moses again prayed. Then the Egyptians will hear about it. Now may the Lord's strength be displayed just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving in sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for their sin, and the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. And what was God's reaction to that? When God saw again his promise and how Moses prayed for the Israelites with this promise of God, he again relented. He wanted to give the second generation the chance, but he fulfilled his promise, leading the people into the Holy Land. It was through this faithfulness and this testimony and the life-giving sacrifice of one servant, Moses, that God's great salvation and sovereign salvation counsel could be continued. After 40 years, Israel's spiritually renewed next generation made a clear decision to be God's holy people, and they entered and conquered the holy promised land as kingdom of priests, and to become a blessing for all nations. This is what we read in the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua. And I also want to mention two other people. These people are Caleb and Joshua. Even under the danger of stoning, when everybody rebelled against Moses, when they heard the unbelief of the 10 other explorers, they testified to the promise of God. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. And do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. And because of this testimony, God could also use them mightily in their salvation history, that they entered the Holy Land as the only one from the first generation, and that they were generals of faith and conquerors who took the promised land in their hand. But what happened to the new kingdom? Now we go back to the point of view of the Israelites, the point of view of the Egyptians, and we see how the new kingdom starts to fall down. Around 1300, Mitanni, this was one ally of the Egyptians, they were defeated by the Hittites. The Kassites, they also went down. And there were repeated Libyan attacks. So there was Libyan attacks, and these Libyan tribes, they plundered the whole western Nile Delta. This was very devastating for Egypt, because this Nile Delta, this Goshen, this is the most fruitful region of all of Egypt. And then there was the Dorian invasion. So this Dorian invasion, this is the through this Dorian invasion, the Greek kingdom went down, the Hittite kingdom went down, and now they attacked attacked Egypt at the Battle of Delta. And at the Battle of Delta against this Dorian invasion, there was victory for Ramesses III, but the problem was all others who were on Egypt's side, they were perished and they were destroyed. And another problem was they had great victory, but they had to pay a very heavy price for that. So because of the many wars and the strong but very costly armies, and keeping the godly order by giving temporals, offerings, and gifts to satisfy the gods, Egypt, at the end of the reign of Ramesses III, they were almost bankrupt. So the state could not ensure proper administration and distribution of food and crops, which again led to social discord, which again led to demonstrations, palace intrigues, workers' rebellion. And at the end, so the whole country is kind of burning, and at the end, Ramesses III leaves his successor a very broken, exhausted, and drained land, which was using its last resources before eventually collapsing. And this collapsing happened in the 20th century, in the 20th dynasty. There was beginning fragmentations. All of the powerful kings of the new kingdom, all of their tombs, they were robbed at that time. People would have to learn how to survive and live poor with what they have because all the wealth of the new kingdom was gone through all these invasions and wars. Many of the magnificent buildings, they were torn down and used for own survival. And in this way, Egypt rushed into the third intermediate period, a period of repeated and renewed chaos. But how did God continue his story? Through the next step in God's salvation history. From a human point of view, the Egyptian weakness led to the rise of Israel. Because Egypt, falling down into the third intermediate period, losing all the conquered territories, they also lost control over Palestine and the Levante. So there was a vacuum of power, and around 1000, this was the time where Egypt, the new kingdom, fell down. This vacuum of power was filled through David and the house of Judah. Now, this house of Judah, this is a proof that they reigned over Israel at that time, because we have the Tel Dan Stele, where it is clearly written that David and the house of Judah were kings over Israel. God said about him, "I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do." And God also gave his great promise to David. "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. I will be his father, and he will be my son. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." David was a man after God's heart who always sought Jesus. He was a foreshadow of Jesus, and it was through this promise that the counsel of God could be continued until Jesus, through the line of David. So what do we learn from this first lesson about Egyptian history? We learn that kingdoms and empires, no matter how powerful they are, that they will perish. Also all the Egyptian kingdoms, the old kingdom, the middle kingdom, and the new kingdom, they all went down. But we also see at the same time that God's promise and sovereign and good counsel stays forever and ever, and it will surely be fulfilled. And God continues his salvation history. So, like Moses, Caleb, and Joshua, let's live as faithful witnesses who hold on to God's promise. And with intercessory prayer, with God's promise, we may pray and serve the young students on the campus, at our schools, and wherever we are. Because we know the zeitgeist, the humanism, and all the spirits and powers of this time, they will also perish. But God uses his faithful servants and spiritual conquerors to continue his everlasting sovereign revival work, to reawaken a vast army, a kingdom of priests in this generation, at the schools and at the 1700 universities, until he returns in all eternity.